Symposium, they cried, I am, the life and work of Paule Marshall and John A. Williams, unsung Black literary voices. I'm Donna Hill, assistant professor at Medgar College and a proud member of the National Black Writers Conference Committee. And I will be joined today by my co-host, Professor Wallace Ford.
I teach here at Medgar College, a member of the faculty of the Department of Public Administration in the School of Business. Also, I've been a participant with the Center for Black Literature over the last 6-7 years. Have 2 published novels, and I invite, and also a blog column that is read in about 70 countries now, thewallaceford.com. And it's a real pleasure to be a part of this historic event. I think this is, for me, Professor Hill, I think about the 3rd or 4th of the biennial conferences, which is, I'm glad it started when I was in my 20s. And
I know, right?
yeah, so, but we're going to try to get moving on here, right? We have a great program, an absolutely great program. And it's my pleasure if the script reads correctly at this point, that I can introduce to everyone the leader of our Center for Black Literature. I'm sorry. Okay, no, I'm sorry. Donna, it is up to you. My apologies. Please proceed.
We're gonna get it together. No
Yes,
worries.
yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
It's
Yes, sir.
still early. It's still
Right,
early. It's
right.
a
This is
pleasure, of course, to be the co-host for today's program, as the Center for Black Literature honors the lives and works of 2 legendary writers, Paule Marshall and John A. Williams. This is a perfect occasion for us to come together, even though it is virtually, to celebrate these amazing writers. In their own unique way and through their impressive body of work, each of them has explored the Black experience in ways that have inspired us, moved us, and made our lives richer because of the work they created and left behind to be shared. While both Marshall and Williams received well-deserved accolades during their lifetimes, the center strongly believes that they did not receive the celebrity treatment or reach the so-called celebrity notoriety outside the non-literary sphere as some other Black artists of their era. The Center for Black Literature is one of the venerable, respected institutions that reminds us that powerful literary voices, such as Marshall and Williams, are among those Black writers and artists who made triumphant breakthroughs and should be recognized for their achievements. We know the importance of saying their names. To keep saying their names is how we remember their lives and their valuable contributions to us.
okay. Yes, thank you, Donna. So we're delighted, of course, to have many of you join us. And in that regard, um, uh, it's your continuous support that makes a difference and helps the center to maintain its programs. During today's challenging times of navigating a global health crisis and the protests against racial and socioeconomic injustice, it is as important as ever to support our esteemed Black cultural and educational institutions such as Medgar College, the Center for Black Literature, and Howard University. Your support is indeed critical. It's critical to their survival today and in the days and years ahead. And so as the Center for Black Literature approaches its 20th anniversary, it is important to note that the center has been at the forefront of honoring Black writers, Black poets, Black artists, and Black literary genius since its founding. For those of you familiar with the center and those of you joining us for this program for the first time, you know that through its, you know or will know that through its various programs such as the National Black Writers Conference, and conferences and symposia, its educational programs and writing workshops, the center has been committed to its mission to broaden and enrich the public's knowledge and aesthetic appreciation of the value of Black literature. Today's program is a continuation of that commitment. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Brenda Green, who is the founder and executive director of the founder and executive director at the Center for Black Literature at Medgar College of the City University of New York. And of course, her full bio is available at the centerforblackLiterature.org. And with that, I do certainly want to say that Dr. Green, of course, is one of, she's not an unsung hero. She is a very well established and acknowledged shiro in terms of this entire movement with respect to Black literature. And so with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Brenda M. Green.
Thank you, Wallace. And first, I should say, thank you, Professor Ford. First, my praises to God, the highest force, whose presence helps to keep me centered and who has helped to sustain us through these very challenging times. Greetings to President Maybank, to Borough President Eric Adams, our distinguished panelists, the Center for Black Literature team, Clarence Reynolds, April Silver, Leah Williams, and Simone Wow, the Writers Steering Committee, the Center for Black Literature interns, our faculty, staff, students, friends, writers, scholars, and literary professionals. I also like to acknowledge some special guests. We have joining us the son of Paul Marshall, Evan Marshall, John Williams, Adam Williams, and his mother, Senator Jabari Brisport, Sister Sonia Sanchez, the Center for Black Literature Advisory Board members, Marshall White, Richard Jones, and Richard Wesley. Our supporters and sponsors are listed in the program journal, which you can download on the Center for Black Literature website, www.centerforblackLiterature.org. I also like to call special attention to New York City Council member Inez Barron, New York City Council Majority Leader Lori Cumbo, the CUNY Office of Academic Affairs, the Gladys Kriebel Dellis Foundation, Aquila Work Songs, the Amazon Literary Partnership, Con Ed, the National Book Foundation, the Cumberbatch Family Trust, the African American Literature Book Club, which is the official bookseller for the National Black Writers Symposium, and Dr. Daisy Coco de Filippis and Hostos Community College. Our symposium is carrying on a legacy begun by the late and visionary John Oliver Killens, who wanted to host a National Black Writers Conference each year. We could not do a major conference in even years and a Black Writers Symposium on odd years. Killens convened the first conference in 1986, and one of the people who helped with that conference is on our panel, Gilyard. You'll be hearing from him later on. Many of our panelists who were part of this program attended those first conferences. Ishmael Reed, Mary Emma Graham, Mary Helen Washington, and Carol Boyce Davies. Edwidge Danticat, Donna Hill, Lawrence Jackson, and Wallace Ford joined us as we continued hosting the conference each year. I want to especially thank them. I called on them and they gladly came to be part of this historic celebration of Paul Marshall and John A. Williams. As I think about today, March 27th, 2021, nearly 1 year after the pandemic began, I feel very blessed and I give thanks and I feel truly grateful to be here. In the midst of these three pandemics, the pandemic around public health, around racism and economic strife, we are surviving. We have lost friends and family. We have experienced the continuing presence of structural racism. We have survived a president who subjected the people of our nation to voter suppression, chronic lies and distortions, a rise in hate and white supremacy and violence, as we witness today again, another mass shooting. The people have survived by protests led by the Black Lives Matter movement. Our writers, our artists, and our musicians have helped us to sustain our spirit. They have expanded our narratives and told our stories. We really value them. They remind us of the cultural memories and of history. They offer us a way forward. We are calling on the names of two writers who have done this for us, Paule Marshall and John Williams. They are truth tellers and gentle spirits who told stories that reflect the full range of the experiences of Black people in the Americas. Thank you for coming to share this important day for us. And now I'd like to welcome our interim president, Dr. Denise Maybank. Dr. Denise Maybank is going to be joining us.
I am.
Okay, so I'd like to just share some information first. Dr. Denise Maybank is currently the interim president of Medgar College. She's also the interim vice chancellor for student affairs and enrollment management for the City University of New York. In this role, she assumes responsibility for unifying the student affairs and enrollment management functions of the university's central office to guide the work of student engagement. And prior to joining CUNY, she served as the vice president and associate provost for student affairs and services at Michigan State University. During her 15-year tenure at Michigan State University, she served in progressive leadership roles, beginning as an associate vice president in 2005. As an active member of the communities in which she has served, she has been directors on boards of civic and social organizations and has often been elected to leadership positions. We thank you here at Medgar College for serving in this leadership position. Welcome, President Maybank.
Thank you, Dr. Green. I am honored to be with you all this morning, and good morning to everyone. I want to acknowledge the participation of the distinguished officials Dr. Green identified and all of the participants present in person and in spirit today. I encountered a quote from John A. Williams as I prepared to join you today. And this is what I learned from his words, and I quote, "If the truth of a time, a people, a state is not available anywhere else, let it be in the novel," end quote. And I found that to be fitting for an opening for our engagement today. I sincerely am grateful to Dr. Brenda Green for the invitation to bring greetings this morning at the convening of the National Black Writers Conference Biennial Symposium. As founder and executive director of the Center for Black Literature and director of the National Black Writers Conference, Dr. Green is a keeper of the treasure and a keeper of the truth. And I thank you for that. I also want to acknowledge Clarence Reynolds as director of the center for keeping it all together. Today's event being held by the center as it approaches its 20th year is important because the center itself is a singular place. We often talk about those things that are rare, but there are things that are singular, not to be compared with anything else. And that is what I believe the Center for Black Literature to be. It exists in a college that is singular. The Medgar College, where there are 4,181 of the most amazing young people anywhere, is certainly a singular place with a singular touch on the lives of those who participate in its experiences. And so today's event is also singular. It points to the lives and the work of two writers identified as unsung Black literary voices, and both who are deserving of this recognition and focus today. I recall my own experience as a high school student being exposed to Paule Marshall's work and reading. I remember reading The Chosen Place, The Timeless People, and trying to work my way through it at first and then just falling in love. And so I'm so glad to be a part throughout the day, and I will be in and out of this experience to hear just what the speakers, the presenters, the scholars will share. As those speakers and presenters illuminate the lives and work of these outstanding writers, we will be inspired, I'm sure. We will be motivated, because it is through the lives of Paule Marshall and John A. Williams that they cried, "I am." And we too today will come face to face with our own lives and experiences through their work, through their words, and through their living. And we too will declare, "I am." Enjoy today's singular experience. And thank you for letting me participate.
Thank you so much for those inspiring words, President Maybank. And now I'd like to on our Brooklyn Borough President, Eric Adams, who has been a strong supporter of the center. Welcome, Borough President Adams.
Thank you so much, Dr. Green and the entire team. You do not allow COVID virus to get in the way of continuing this legacy of lifting up Black literature and our Black writers and authors. And let me say this in my 60 seconds on how and why Black literature is so important to me. When I was a young man, 15 years old, many of you are aware that I was arrested and beat by police officers, and it had such a traumatic impact on me. And it was not until I picked up a book by Ralph Ellison and started reading it, and I really just put my entire spirit and energy in that. And that led to a chain of other books by Black writers. And there was such a healing effect on me that I was able to see that no matter what we went through, we would bend, but we would never break. And that is why it's imperative that we really bring Black literature into our everyday school system. Our students should see those images and writers that look like them and share some of the same experiences and have overcome some of the challenging times that we experience in life. Those books showed me that even in your dark moments, they're not burials, they're merely plantings. And we should allow the fruits of those plantings to feed others as they go through these crises. We need Black literature now more than ever as we're dealing with some of the mental health crisis that our young people are experiencing as they cycle out of COVID-19. And so I thank you for having the vision and understanding how important it is to have great Black writers and authors and literature that is pervasive throughout our entire city. Keep doing what you're doing. Dr. Green, you saw it long before anyone else understood it, that the borough of Brooklyn should be a place where this amazing conference should take place year after year. Thank you. I appreciate you and enjoy the entire day.
Okay, Dr. Green?
Yes, thank you so much, President Adams. I'd just like to acknowledge that our new Senator, Jabari Brisport, is in the audience, and I'd like to thank him for his support. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you again to our guests, and obviously President Maybank, glad to have you on board, and of course always great to see Borough President Adams. And we're going to now begin the formal part of today's program with a roundtable discussion entitled Reflections on the Life and Work of Paule Marshall and John A. Williams. The speakers on this panel will offer personal perspectives and reflections on Marshall and Williams, who were major contributors to the canons of African American and Caribbean literature. The speakers are Edwidge Danticat, Evan Marshall, Ishmael Reed, Linda Villarosa, and Keith Gilyard. Leading the discussion will be Ms. Jamia Wilson. And I'll just briefly introduce Sister Wilson, and then my job is to get out of the way, right? So, but Jamia Wilson is a feminist activist, writer, and speaker. She joined Random House as vice president and executive editor in 2021. As the former director of the Feminist Press at the City University of New York and former VP of programs at the Women's Media Center, Jamia has been a leading voice on women's rights issues for more than a decade. Her work has appeared in numerous outlets, including the New York Times, the Today Show, CNN, BBC, Rookie, Refinery 29, and the Washington Post. She is also the author of Young, Gifted, and Black. It's published by Wide-Eyed Editions in 2018. And please review her complete bio in the program journal, which you can download from our Center for Black Literature.org. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Wilson, who will, of course, introduce the other panelists. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ford. I'm so thrilled to be here today to talk about these beautiful and impactful and brilliant authors who made an indelible mark on literature in general, but specifically on the canons of African American and Caribbean literature. I'm so honored to be joined by Edwidge Danticat, Ishmael Reed, Linda Villarosa, Keith Gilyard, and it sounds like soon, Evan Marshall also join us. And I will briefly give you a little bit of a quick hit of all of their distinguished bios, and you can read in the journal more to learn more about their impactful work. Edwidge Danticat is the author of several books, including Breath, Eyes, Memory, Creek Crack, The Farming of Bones, The Dew Breaker, and Everything Inside Stories. She is a two-time winner of the Story Prize, a MacArthur Fellow, and the winner of the 2018 Neustadt Prize for Literature. Ishmael Reed is the author of novels, plays, poetry, and nonfiction, and has received prizes in every category. The University of California at Berkeley's Distinguished Emeritus Awardee for the year 2020 has a new poetry collection, Why the Black Hole Sings the Blues, and has also released this through the Dalkey Archive Press in November of 2020. So it's brand new and fresh. I also wanted to share that he was also mentioning that on neorecon.org earlier in our green room conversation that you can find another upcoming production that you should definitely get involved with and find out more information too at ishmaelreed.org. And I also wanted to say specifically that it's my honor to introduce Linda Villarosa, who is the chair of the board at the Feminist Press at CUNY. I'm really proud to be a part of the Feminist Press's extended family now and the CUNY family. Linda Villarosa is contributing editor to the New York Times Magazine, where she covers race and public health, and the former executive editor of Essence Magazine. In 2019, she contributed to the Pulitzer Prize winning 1619 Project, and she had an essay specifically highlighting the physiological myths based on race that have endured since slavery. Linda is a teacher of journalism and Black studies at the City College of New York in the CUNY family and is writing a book, Under the Skin, Race, Inequality, and the Health of a Nation, which will be published later this year by Doubleday. Keith Gilyard is the author and editor of 25 books, including True to the Language Game, African Discourses, Cultural Politics, and Pedagogy by Routledge, and John Oliver Killens, Black Literary Activism from University of Georgia Press. And he is the two-time recipient of the American Book Award and has served on the faculties of Medgar Evers College and CUNY, where he helped to launch the National Black Writers Conference, thank you, where we are now, and Syracuse University. And he's currently a scholar and the Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of English and African American Studies at Penn State. I just also wanted to check and see if we have Evan Marshall with us now, who I'm also excited to introduce, but will say that we may be joined with Evan later on, who moved to London from New York City in 1990 to pursue his dream of becoming an internationally versed yacht designer. This will be the first yacht designer that I have ever met, so I'm really excited about that. Having started his professional career in the mid-1980s, here in New York City at Sparkman Stevens, Marshall soon began to feel that European design philosophy and approaches held more interest for him. And Marshall has focused his work on yacht interior and exterior designs, as well as residential projects, and has established a company with a unique reputation by embracing a variety of styles and tastes as they take on new design challenges. So you can find out more about this distinguished panel in the journal, but I also wanted you to know when Evan Marshall comes in that he will also be a very big part of this conversation. So thank you all for joining me on this bright day to talk about the contributions of Marshall and Williams. And the first thing I wanted to ask is, can you all please reflect and think about a personal, memorable moment that you have connected to one or both of these authors? What was a click moment for you that happened as a result of meeting their words on the page? And if you unmute yourself, then I'll know you're ready to speak.
Well, I'll start. So I grew up in Denver, Colorado, and really didn't come to New York until I was in college. I came once and I didn't really like it. And so then I went back to finish college in Colorado, and I took a Black literature course, Afro-American literature course, and read Brown Girl, Brown Stones, and loved it. So then when I moved to New York to pursue a career in media, I ended up in Brooklyn. And one of my first and still best friends is Jacqueline Woodson. And so she knew that I really hardly knew anything about New York City and even less about Brooklyn, even though I was living there. So I remember she took me around to sort of tour Brooklyn and show me her old neighborhood where she grew up. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, there's Chauncey, and there's, you know, Fulton, and there's this. And she's like, how do you even know that? And I said, Brown Girl, Brown Stones. And so that helped introduce me to the borough that I still live in for 30 years later, but I really appreciate that and her and Paula Marshall's work.
I guess I'll pick up with Brown Girl, Brown Stone as well. For me, I read Brown Girl, Brown Stone when my parents were trying to really working just as hard as the family in the book to try to buy a house in East Flatbush. And my father had a very similar attitude, that you don't belong to a place until you own a piece of land. And it was a really extreme sacrifice. People at church had to co-sign for us, but when we finally moved into the house, and I remember reading Brown Girl, Brown Stone and fully understanding what was driving my parents to want to actually own this house. And then when I got a chance to work with Paule Marshall at New York University, actually, because she had made it possible. I remember she had this amazing laugh, that I just remember her laugh and her often cradling her face as she was speaking. And for the kind of introductory job interview, I went to visit her in her apartment that she had in Washington, New Washington Square Park. And I said, how did you manage such a beautiful apartment? She said, well, when I was interviewing with the dean, they said, where do you want to live? And I looked around his fancy office and I said, something like this. and it was I thought she kind of always knew her value, which is, both in the work and in the person, but also reach back to younger generations, to younger people. She was great if you sought her out for advice, and was really always present and didn't really like to talk. You always wanted to be at her knee, if you will, but she didn't really, she would raise you, like to look her in the eye, and was always open and welcome. So the work, when the work and the person match in that way, I feel like it's an incredible ancestral blessing as she was to me and to so many of us.
Yes, I love that, the ancestral blessing, and thinking about that in the context of the conversation we're having now. I think too, I just wanted to reflect on what both of you said around the connection between everyone and time and space, that I was reading about how Paul Marshall passed within 6 days of Toni Morrison. And just hearing both of your reflections had me thinking about, you know, what they embodied, but also what they've continued on in terms of the impact they've made on everyone who's on this call, but also just in terms of the reverberations in the world as a community. So for those personal reflections, I would love to hear more from the rest of our panelists about what your personal experiences were, or the memories you have of connecting with their work. These are so delicious. I want more.
Yeah, I'll get in. It isn't so much the work, though. The work is important, but it's more of a personal connection. I sort of follow on what Edwidge was saying. You know, I was one of Paul Marshall's students at Columbia University, and that's when I learned not to say Paule, but to say Paul. And she taught me that really early. But I remember her as a very calming presence. She was my instructor for a year. We had different aesthetics, you know. Remember, this was back in the mid '70s, so I was out of those '60s and '70s streets, and Paul Marshall's aesthetic wasn't quite my aesthetic, and so we bumped heads a little bit, but it was all good. She was a calming presence, and when I look back, everything that she was telling me about writing was actually correct. I just was too bullheaded to see it at the time, but I had to do a lot of rewrites. I remember that, and I had to go to her apartment. I wasn't, Edwidge was lucky. She got to go in and sit around. I just had to stand at the door and hand the paper in, you know. But because of having been a student, I always followed her career. And she's just a major presence. You talk about she and Toni. Toni was actually a visitor to our class one day. So I remember, you know, looking at from one to the other, and you understood the blessing at the time. Also, one day she came to class and she had James Baldwin with her, and said James Baldwin spent 3 hours with us. But I always saw Paul Marshall as very calming presence, and so I have fond memories of her that way, for sure. And I just read a recent book by Shane Graham, and he talks about how she is the embodiment of the ideals that Langston Hughes tried to put forward. Langston wanted to be this international figure that was trying to bridge the African diaspora. So Langston was always meeting the African writers, Caribbean writers, and writers based in the US. And Langston was a little short on that gender question though, and right? So Paul did everything that Langston did, and maybe went a step beyond. So she might have been a fuller Langston, and even Langston, which is an argument that this book makes, which I think is a very interesting argument. But anyway, I think those are the immediate personal reflections that come back to me. And I just wanted to say that, yeah, I was around for the '86 conference. And I just wanted to note before moving on that we could not have done that conference without several people, but particularly two people who are no longer among us. And that is the late Arnold Kemp, who was a major mover and shaker with respect to that conference. And the other one, the late Steve Cannon, whom we should do a symposium around one day. We could not have done that conference without Steve Cannon, for sure. So I'll say that. I'll pass the mic.
Yes, I'm excited to hear from Ishmael Reed, to hear if you have any reflections that you'd like to share.
We organized the Before Columbus Foundation in 1976. We're going into our 41st anniversary of distributing the American Book Awards, which is competitive with the awards that reward tokenism. As a matter of fact, the Washington Post says that Our American Book Awards is the American League to the National Book Awards, National League, if you were following baseball. Edwidge, very talented writer, and Paule Marshall among the recipients, and also Keith Gilyard of the American Book Awards. Our directors include both the former and current United States Poet Laureates. The current United States Poet Laureate is Joy Harjo. I published her book 40 years ago, second book of poetry, What Moon Drove Me to This. Juan Felipe Herrera was a former United States Poet Laureate. Marlon James, a Booker Prize winner. The late Rudy Anaya, who received the Presidential Medal for literature. So when the recipients of the American Book Awards know that they're being honored by their peers who are writers, okay? Also, I published Powwow. It's very long. This is probably the most important multicultural anthology of short stories. We even have, I found a story by Benjamin Franklin, who accused the slave owners of hypocrisy because they're all for the liberation of so-called white slaves who've been captured by the Muslims, but supported slavery here. And Ntozake Shange, a number of people are in there. So Paule Marshall, I met her in California, in Berkeley. I had read Chosen Place, Timeless People, which I think is a masterpiece. And I think both Johnny Williams and Paule Marshall dealt with patronage, the problem of patronage, especially Johnny Williams. Now, this is how Johnny Williams instructed me. When I went, my first encounter with Johnny Williams was in high school. And I used to watch the Today Show. It's like, I'm like married to television ever since I was a kid. I was one of the first people in the project who had a television set. So I used to watch the Today Show. And I wrote a letter to the Today Show, NBC, asking why no Black writers had ever appeared on the network. And so they had Johnny Williams on and some other Black writers. Secondly, I was in the apartment of Philip Wooby. We all gathered around there where we read in the Herald Tribune that Johnny Williams had been denied the Prix de Rome. And they mentioned that there was one other Black person who received the Prix de Rome. And I said, who would that be? And Philip Wooby, sitting right there, he said it was me. Philip Wooby taught classics at Howard University, and he translated Lucretius at the age of 18 or 19 or something like that. And then when I went to New York, I met John. And I was very naive. I thought that if you wrote well, you could get over as a writer, because my Buffalo address wasn't doing me any good. So at 22, I went to New York. 22, you do anything stupid, you know. And met Johnny Williams. And he taught me, he and John O'Killens taught me the politics of literature. That I think the reason that Paul Marshall and Johnny Williams are unsung is because they weren't as ruthless as the others. Now I know everybody likes James Baldwin, and I knew James Baldwin. And you know, there's a big renaissance. You got all these guys writing letters to their nephews. There are more Baldwin impersonators than Elvis impersonators in Las Vegas. But James Baldwin was ruthless. And one of the reasons he climbed to the top, besides having talent, was that he took down the competition. Not only Richard Wright, but Langston Hughes, Chester Himes. I mean, he did hatchet jobs on all those people. And he had more clout or backing from anti-Stalinists who ran the New York literary scene at the time than the others. Now we got this Baldwin Renaissance where Louise Merriweather had to go to GoFundMe to raise money for round-the-clock care. She's 96 years old. Now, if she was white, she would be considered the dean of Black writing. She's 96, recovering from COVID. She had to go ask money from GoFundMe when Daddy Was the Number Runner. It's probably just as good as Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is all about the rites of passage of a young boy preacher, where Louise Merriweather took on some of the political issues of the day. foreclosure, housing foreclosure, police brutality. It's all in her book. So I think it's that we neglect the politics of the whole thing. And I think the reason that we can say that Johnny Williams and Paule Marshall are unsung is because they didn't have the backing that was necessary for them to cross over at the time. Now, one last point. There are very few people who had the range among American writers as Johnny Williams and John Killens. I just wrote the introduction to The Minister primarily, which has locations in London, United States, Africa. And I think both Johnny Williams and John Killens expanded our knowledge of Africa. I mean, they are so sophisticated about Africa that they're able to distinguish between different tribes and different languages. I mean, John Killens, for example, has Hausa, it's a discussion of the language spoken in northern Nigeria. Clifford's Blues is bilingual. I mean, you read Clifford's Blues is bilingual because it's both German. As a matter of fact, there are songs written in German. So these are international writers. They had a range that very few writers, they talk about Philip Roth. Philip Roth was a provincial bigot. I mean, and did not have the range that these writers had. So I think that the last point, Brown and Black, I want to congratulate Brenda Green and people at Medgar. It's almost unheard of for an institution like this theirs to last this long. But the last point is, Brown and Black people in New York have an opportunity to call the shots, unlike the New York Times Book Review, which is run by a woman who says her favorite bookstore is in London. I mean, God, you know, Anglo. And I'm in conversation with both her and another writer, another publisher. I said, I've never seen the byline of an important Black critic in any of these magazines. I mean, they sort of like farm these things out. They had one guy write about thrillers of the 1960s, Black thrillers of the 1960s. He left out Chester Himes. I said, you know, why don't you, I mean, you know, American readers will never, the late Reginald Martin, who's a genius, I mean, you know, literary critic. I've never seen, so I think Black and Brown academics, you don't have to go to the African American Review, which is run by some overseer. I had a clash with him. He had to write something saying he wasn't working for the government. And I just brought up the question and said, did the question ever come up that you were working for the government? He threatened to sue me, told me to cease and desist. He's now running the African American Review, a disgrace. So I think that, you know, Black and Brown people in New York have an opportunity to turn this thing over so that the unsung writers become sung. That's all I got to say, really.
Thank you. So I think, you know, there's a lot that's come up. I'm synthesizing and weaving everything that everyone's brought forth. And what came to mind for me, you know, was the lineage of the literary foreparents and those of us who are still here. And when you talked about the systems that these authors were operating in, Williams, Marshall, but also the other names that came up, Baldwin, Morrison, and the issue of patronage going back to the Harlem Renaissance and how that affected authors, how it's affecting people now in a different way, in a different structural way, as you mentioned, around reviews and also awards. All of it, I wanted to bring forth the weaving of how this all comes together too, around how maybe there are things that are changing, but there's some similar themes, there are similar patterns that continue to express themselves with each generation. And I think that hearing everybody's reflections around that brings me to a question around, although we know that these systemic issues continue to persist and manifest in these different ways, but also all familiar ways throughout the generations, how would you describe the significance of both of these authors and what they've taught you and us about how we need to operate now to make literature more accessible to marginalized authors, to make literature more representative of the fullness of who we are? I would love to hear any thoughts about that. Oh, and I see that Evan Marshall is here.
Yes, apologies for being late. Thank you.
Hi,
Good morning and
welcome.
good afternoon, depending on where everyone is. It's afternoon for me.
Good morning and good afternoon in the United Kingdom.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to recap for you that, we were speaking about the indelible mark made by Paul Marshall and Johnny Williams, and we spoke about you. I was saying you were the first yacht designer and builder that I have ever met, so that's also just very exciting. But we were talking about asking everyone for a personal reflection. And so I feel like specifically with you, I want to go back to that question now that you're with us to hear your personal reflection on the impact that these authors had in your life.
Well, I mean, for me, one of the fascinating things is so many of these individuals were people I knew from a very young age and were friends of the family in the sense that some of their impact initially wasn't I wasn't aware of because I was very young. They were just nice people, whether it was Auntie Maya or James Baldwin coming to the house. They were people that I saw from a very young age and then didn't get to appreciate until I was, got a little older and began to read their work or to really appreciate the power and the impact they had on just the diaspora, the African diaspora, in terms of communicating, who we are and the struggles that we've gone through. So I can remember for me, what was oftentimes so important in my own development was getting to the age where I could have conversations, not just with my mother about her work and what she was seeking to communicate, but so many others. And I think there's not one incident I can remember, but there was a point where my mother, for me, in conversations with her, went from being sometimes someone I was annoyed with because she was telling me to do my homework or to clean up my room or not letting me go out and play. She went from that to being someone, as I read lines in a book, who I just could not believe how talented and what an ability she had to sculpt words and talk about character or develop character. And it was like, whoa, this is my mom. And I kind of look up and maybe hear her in the next room, think, I had no idea that ability, that power, and it developed, of course, gave me a tremendous amount of respect, more respect for her. And then I began to discover that so many of the other people, we're talking about were of a similar power, and you don't oftentimes discover that even when you know them for quite a long time, until you begin to yourself personally read their work or learn about what they did, what they were about. So that was, discoveries for me, of which I had many, because many of these people were part of my growing, that you don't discover until you really connect with their work.
Thank you. And I just want to bring forth, there was a beautiful remark that Edwidge made earlier about people who match on the page with how they were in life. And so just hearing you say that is just a beautiful thread that I wanted to connect together. The deeper relationship you get when you meet them on the page, but also the affirmation of that essence is really amazing. So I wanted to go back and say, is there anyone who had, anything to say about this issue of, what can we learn from what they taught us for how to operate within these systems, or for people who are setting out to, in their own literary careers, what can we take away from how to move forward from how they lived?
I think one of the things that John talked about, I mean, you have your path as an artist, people have to work that out. But John, to pick up on what Ishmael was talking about, John was always attuned to literary politics. And so one of the things that he would always talk about was not so much what a writer had to do, but what the audience had to do. That if you wanted certain products, if you wanted certain material to be generated and you wanted those writers to be successful, you had to support those writers. And I remember John was at the first conference. He was at the conference in 1986. And I remember it so well because I was sitting right next to him on a panel with Tony K. Bombara, Arthur Flowers, and Brenda Wilkinson. And one of the things I remembered him talking about at that conference in '86, he was imploring the audience, he would say, buy Black books, buy Black books to build up that readership, and he said, I don't even care if you don't read the book, but buy the book, buy the book and pass it along, make it a gift, make it a present. So that's one of the things I think we still have to do. We still have to build up a certain kind of readership so we can have an impact. As Ishmael is saying, we can be shot callers, respect to the critical establishment and whatnot, because we can't do any of that unless we actually create the demand as readers. And that's one of the things I remember him talking about a lot. He came up to Syracuse to visit when I was teaching up there, and we had that same discussion up there. And I think he came the same week that Toni Morrison received the Nobel Prize or something. So he was very pleased about that. But he was always talking about audience. He was always talking about readership and trying to negotiate that literary establishment. Like Ishmael talked about Clifford's Blues. I love Clifford's Blues, have taught it. John A. Williams told me that novel was rejected 57 times before it was accepted. And he actually pounded on the table. He said, I'm gonna show you what it feels like. And he hit the table 57 times. He said, that's how many times it was rejected before it was accepted.
His novel was also rejected, The Minister primarily. His posthumous novel.
Yeah, I know that.
It's because of Amistad that Charles Harris founded that this book is coming out.
Yeah, definitely. But in terms of the literary moment, I think the other thing I think he might say is stay attuned, and be visionary. Obviously, the textual moment for my whole generation was The Man Who Cried I Am, and even if people didn't read through the whole book, some people just got the book to turn to the last chapter. They wanted to read about that King Alfred plan, the plan for what to do with a surplus population that was no longer needed. Should they try to rebel, rise up, and we have all these places for them, these prisons that are 3 and 4 stories underground. I remember we're gonna take the expressways. The reason we run the expressways through the middle of the hood is so that we can have easy access for the military tanks. That was our chapter. I remember a lot of the rest of the novel, but I know a whole lot of people, all they know about that novel is the last chapter, that King Alfred plan. So I think part of what people were teaching it is fact. I remember going to workshops and people explaining to me how the King Alfred plan worked. I said, wait a minute, that came out of a novel, And they said, no, it might have come out of a novel, but it's true though, And so I think one of the things John would say is be visionary, be visionary in your work, man. Try to see different possibilities and that kind of stuff. I don't know that he would be overly prescriptive. Paule Marshall was prescriptive, as I was saying earlier. She had a definite idea of what novels should look like. I think John probably was a little more open with that. But both great instructors. You can learn a lot from either one, that's for sure.
I remember watching an acceptance speech, I think that John A. Williams gave for an award he received from the African American Literary Book Club, where he talked about the King Arthur plan, where he put that chapter on buses and would leave them and then people would pick it up and he would watch their faces change as they were reading about this plan, as though it was something that was being announced and that they were being warned about. And I thought that was such a powerful use of fiction. And then he talked about in the acceptance speech how then after that, his phones were bugged, and then he would come home to lights being on in his house. And so there was, for me, I always thought that was sort of powerful that he knew the power of fiction and how it could infiltrate our lives. And at the end of that speech, he says, a writer has no function more important than telling the truth about ourselves. And I think that's something that both Paule Marshall and John A. Williams did very powerfully in telling us these very painful and potential truths also about ourselves.
I wanted to say that as the daughter of a bookstore owner, Black independent bookstore, first in Denver and then in Harlem, I learned from my mother that the publishing goes in cycles. And so, you know, it starts with, oh, Black people don't read, Black people don't buy books. Then it's like, oh my God, Black people read, Black people buy books. Quickly, let's, you know, do something. This is the publishing industry doing that. And then it goes back down. It's like, oh, you know, Black people really don't read, Black books don't sell, Black people don't buy books. And so I think the thing is, we cannot be sucked into the, you know, whims of what's happening in the publishing industry when we have urgent stories that we need to tell. The history of Paule Marshall in the Feminist Press, where I'm on the board, is that her book, Brown Girl, Brownstones, was in 1959 and then went out of print. And so the Feminist Press started in 1970. And then because there weren't enough women's books just by women being published. And it started mostly reprinting other books. And so one of the biggest requests was, please somebody reissue Brown Girl, Brownstones. Mary Helen Washington, Dr. Washington, I see is here. And she was one of the people who whispered in the ear of our founder and said, you know, you should reissue this. And then they went to Paule Marshall and said, you know, we'd like to reissue your book. And Paule Marshall said, I don't know, you all don't have a lot of money and you don't seem like you're really sustainable. And, you know, so they, I'm sure, were, you know, down on their knees. And then, so what happened is it turned into a win-win. So there was a huge appetite for her book, and it's still one of the biggest sellers at Feminist Press with 150,000 copies sold. And, you know, it's been reprinted by other people. It was reissued with, you know, Edwidge, thank you, in 2006 for doing the foreword, and Dr. Washington did the afterword. And it still had the same art on the cover, which was a piece that was, Evan, on your mom's wall, as I understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the cover.
Yes, and now it's here with me in London. It got flown over last year.
I love that. I was just going to say, when I saw that, it just made me have a moment of emotion, because when I walked into the Feminist Press many years before I would know that I would work there, but it was to interview for an entry-level job years before. And I was super excited. I didn't even have an apartment in New York yet. I was coming in trying to move to New York. I was handed a copy of that edition of the book, and I still have it. And I think of it as a very iconic object of, you know, what it means to be a Black person in the literary world and feeling an immense amount of pride. So thank you for showing that, because I remember feeling like I'd had the best day of my life, that I had visited the Feminist Press and been given a copy of that book from the place that it was printed and published. And, you know, just gave me a sense of, you know, what it means for our authors to be out there to show the next generation what's possible. So I see that Mary Helen Washington is here. So I wanted to see, before we go to Q&A, would you like to share a reflection as well?
Well, I wanted to say something about the ruthlessness of the publishing industry, and thank you, Ishmael, for that term. But Paule had a long struggle with Feminist Press, and at the end of her life was still in that struggle to get the rights back to Brown Girl Brownstones, so that it could be published in a larger trade edition, you know, with different covers and things that would have helped the publicity of that book. And so, you know, part of the reason for us not knowing much about that book is because Feminist Press didn't have the distribution arm that other large publishers had, and would not relinquish the rights to the novel. In terms of personal reactions or personal stories about Paule, I can't even remember when I met Paule. It seems like I just always knew her, but I think I must have met her at a conference, and you know, after that she invited me to New York and took me to see Fences with, I think Evan was with us. I think he was about 11. And we went to see it with James Earl Jones in the lead. And the point I wanted to make is what a New Yorker she was. I mean, this is a woman who loved, you know, art galleries and films and theater and all kinds of Black cultural events in Harlem and was a part of all of that. Not to play down Brooklyn, because Brooklyn was there as, you know, part of her growing up. But she's very much, this is a very, very sophisticated and cosmopolitan New Yorker and person of the world.
Well, we're actually discovering some of the research for what you're working on is that even when my mother just started Hunter College, she was going to concerts at Carnegie Hall and, you know, frequenting, you know, establishments in Midtown that were quite well known, and was probably just people watching and enjoying culture. But it was remarkable just thinking, she did tell me, she said, oh, I used to go, we were at Carnegie Hall once, much later for some event. I must have been, you know, 8 or 9. And she said, Evan, look back up there. See up there, way up in the rafters? I used to be up there in college at, you know, for concerts, whether it was opera or whatever. And she was just, you know, someone who was just so determined to broaden her horizons intellectually, not just with a focus about her experiences as an African-American, as Afro-Caribbean descendant, but, you know, just as an American as well. So she took on, you know, the towering, you know, giants of all literature to expand her own horizon in writing ability and technique. So that's been a fascinating, you know, experience just to discover some of that. And of course, we want to eventually one day have more people learn about it.
One of the things that she said about New York when she was going to Hunter, she was just a 20-year-old, maybe even younger than that. She was so excited about learning about and being a part of the Manhattan world. She said, you know, at some little hangout where she used to have coffee in the morning, she said, Duke Ellington tried to pick me up. And she was quite elated about that. It was like, it was another little feather in her cap as a New Yorker.
Thank you. I'm just imagining that in my head right now, and the montage of that time, and it's very exciting. Yeah. So I want to thank you all so much. This has gone by so quickly, but I just feel a real deep sense of gratitude to be a part of this conversation. And I'm thinking about some of the authors, you know, who aren't in the conversation with us now, but who I very much feel are a part of the conversation in terms of people who have been influenced by these authors we spoke about, like Nicole Dennis Benn and Jason Reynolds as well, who come to mind and who I know are very much a part of our community. So I wanted to broaden our circle. Zoom is a square, but I prefer to envision it as a circle right now, and to ask for everyone who's joining us in the larger circle to bring in your questions through the Q&A so that we can have a conversation in a deeper community. So if you have questions, let's drop them in. So we have a question from Sherry Tolliver, who asks, are there any documentaries about Paul Marshall or John Williams? Does anyone know?
Mary Helen, we haven't really discovered any documentaries. There's some pretty extensive interviews of my mother on YouTube, which were interesting to discover. And in fact, there's a lovely high school student's interpretation of my mother's story about her grandmother on YouTube, which is done as a cartoon. But no, seriously, in terms of documentaries, no, there isn't really anything. And I think, you know, in many respects, my mother was really so much about her work. She oftentimes wasn't pushing herself. She had no interest necessarily in PR, but I think, you know, what hasn't really happened is more of a dissemination of who she was, what she was about, what her you know, the power of her work. So, you know, that's something hopefully that we'll be able to change soon.
I think there's a documentary underway. I talked to someone who's from Brooklyn. First name is Marsha. Not recalling her last name, but she and her partner were working on a documentary.
Yeah, and they've been in touch. I think maybe COVID kind of slowed the project down because I haven't heard from them lately. But yes, that is something that was kind of being thought about, was being developed.
I think one of the problems confronting writers like Johnny Williams and Paule Marshall is that the reviewers who know very little about Black literature, but who dominate the discussion,
Yes.
seem to see Black literature in terms of renaissances. And each renaissance erases whatever came before.
Mhm.
So Time Magazine, they have a renaissance every 20 years. And the last renaissance was supposed to be the end all renaissances of renaissances. Now we got another one. So I look at the latest renaissance, and all those people who are mentioned there are very good writers, but we know writers all over the country who write as well. So I think that's the approach. They're either Columbusing or they're giving, or Black literature is an orphan. Like I'm having a discussion with people at the New York Times Book Review and the New Yorker. And there was a review of Wanda Coleman's book. I knew Wanda Coleman, I published Wanda Coleman. As a matter of fact, she's in this book of short stories. And it said that she was influenced by Whitman. Wanda Coleman ain't got nothing to do with, except that they both wrote in English, I guess. She ain't got nothing to do with Walt Whitman. The other thing is Columbusing. So there was a review that said that the lost giant of American literature, William Melvin Kelly, he wasn't no lost giant. I mean, William Melvin Kelly and his family attended Black Renaissance magazine receptions until his death. So I think that the presumption is that there's no tradition. So when you get a Black critic, however, they give it some kind of they give Black antecedents. For example, I got a Black critic to Eleanor Traylor to review a novel by William Gardner Smith. Somebody ought to do a book on World War II writers, because all these guys, William Denby, I just published his book was turned down too. She was able to connect it to a 19th century Black tradition. This novel that William Gardner Smith wrote. So I think that we really need to challenge the publishing company, which is, I think they have 1 or 2 Black editors, and they must be the most powerful people in the world, because I get emails from prominent people all over the world, but Black editors in New York don't answer your emails. They're very powerful. This is still a segregated industry. And I don't know how you change that. You know, they have some token editors. And this is a literature where Black critics are still the Negro leagues. you know what I mean? The question we have to ask is why a few Black writer tokens are acceptable, but Black critics are denied access to this industry. I think those are the points I want to make.
Thank you. So I have another question. And so thank you for all the questions that are coming in. I'm going to try to make sure I get to them all because we have quite a few. And the next one is from Renee B. Johnson. How does the trend towards self-publishing impact mainstream publishing trends and the place of Black writers? And I think this aligns with some of what has come up around that too, but I wanted to hear what your thoughts are.
I don't know exactly. I mean, I'm not on the inside like that. I don't know what impact self-publishing is having on mainstream publishing. I only suspect from what I've seen that if you have any success with self-publishing, they're gonna try to buy you out. That's all I've seen. I remember when Shahrazad Ali, made the big splash by self-publishing her book back in the day, and as soon as it started selling, in neighborhoods, the corporate publishers were there to take it over. It's sort of, it's like selling mixtapes out of your trunk. When you get on, and Sony's gonna take it. So the impact I see is that if there's a new artistic direction to be taken, the underground has always been able to show the way, but they'll, I would say, 9 times out of 10 they'll be taught out. They'll be bought out. I mean, so taught out too, I guess. But they'll be bought out. So that's the only impact I see. I don't know that people publishing independently sets the agenda for what the corporate publishers are doing, other than if they see some profit in it, they're coming to get it.
Well, I'll address that. A few years ago, my sister and I started a tiny publishing company that was just short of self-publishing. So we would help authors to get their books up, and it was completely out of the mainstream. And the way we did it was mostly through our networks and social media. And that was an opportunity that's newer than it used to be back, when people were selling books off tables and stuff like that, because you didn't necessarily have to, I mean, that's still not a bad way sometimes, but we had events. We had a very narrow list of people who we knew would be interested in our books, and we used our media contacts. So it was just a different thing. And our authors, they didn't get rich off the money that they made, but they definitely made money because we didn't have any overhead, none of us, and we were working out of our different houses. And so there was a way to make money in ways that is different from the past, because we didn't have to sell that many books. Let's say we sold 15,000 copies of one of our biggest book, and that was great. That was really good and made money for our author.
Thank you. And I think, I wanted to share too, I'm familiar sometimes with people who have decided to go into self-publishing after they've published in other ways also, depending on the project and that sort of thing too. So I think, there's some good writing out there around what kind of model is right for you around looking at the self-publishing or a more hybrid model too. But really want to thank you for the question, because I've really learned a lot from the wisdom we've heard on this call, but also get a lot of questions from people who are asking me, is this the right way to go right now? And so I think it's a really important question that a lot of people are engaging with.
You have to think about it. I mean, you saw the movie, Ray Charles. Ray Charles had to leave Atlantic, so you folks saw the movie. Right. So, there's politics, there's money, there's all that involved. So, yeah.
I thought that General Killens called for a Black collective publishing. You know about that, Keith?
Yes.
Yeah, because you wrote about it.
Mm-hmm.
He called for how does that happen? I think it'd be very simple to construct something like that with a low printing costs.
So,
comments on that? Keith Gilyard.
And thanks, Marcia Keys. I saw in the chat, you asked a question saying, do I remember you? I said, you're one of the most important people in my formal education. How could I not know or remember Marcia Keys, who was an instructor when I was in community college years ago, even though she's not that old. But of course, Marcia Keys, just give you a shout out.
Thank you. So I have some more questions coming in, and I want to get this question too. That's about canons. So I'm really interested to hear what comes up here. Can the panelists talk about the canons Williams and Marshall are a part of? And this is from Denson Staples. I'm especially wondering about how we situate them within American or Western literature at large versus or in tandem with African American lit and Caribbean lit.
One of the things I would say, it's a large question. I would say when I'm thinking about Paul Marshall, I just read this book called Cultural Entanglements. I think I had mentioned it to Mary Helen a few weeks ago, but that book really is an attempt to set Paul Marshall within a whole tradition of transatlantic writing. It's not an attempt to set her into the context of a Euro-American canon. I won't speak to that, but it's an attempt to set her within the context of a African diasporic tradition that goes all the way back to Claude McKay and before. And so there's work, and people are working on that, and so they're setting that. I think Cultural Entanglement, Shane Graham, that's a good book to get if you want to look at the Marshall end of it. I would say that, and of course John A. is in a tradition of writing that we can go back and in the African American literary canon, I guess you can kind of start it with Wright, in a sense, and then you go from Wright to Himes, from Himes to Petrie, from Petrie to Ellison, from Ellison to Reed, and at the same time you go from Ellison to Reed, you go from Wright to John A. Williams in mid-60s, and then on down from there. So that's kind of how I look at that picture.
I think
you could see just from your list what happens when you have canons. You could see what happens to women writers.
Yeah.
All these
I said Petrie. I said Petrie, Mariella.
Yeah, I know you threw Petrie in there, but that ain't getting it. No. The problem with canons is how they squeeze people out. You know, it's not how they include people. So
right.
You have one of the problems with Paule Marshall, and I'm sure it's the same with John Williams, is that here you have a writer who's writing mainly about women. So in the 1950s, when it's Baldwin, Wright, and Ellison all the time, you got no room for her. She's also a writer who spans different cultures and different countries. And so, you know, she talks about the fact that she's part of a West Indian culture or Caribbean culture and an African American culture. And she does it, she says over and over again, don't try to put me in one or the other, because I am, you know, cannot be constricted that way. And the same thing I think about her writing about sexuality. You know, it won't come up if you have certain kind of canons in place. So I see her as, and John A. Williams too, as people who are, you know, always busting these canons, and that we should not be trying to enclose them in any of them, especially the Western canon. As soon as a Black writer writes about another country, not the United States, it's like, oh, well, I don't know, they don't really belong. Right. You know, somehow we can't encompass this other thing. And Marshall was always directing her writing from Brown Girl Brownstones ends with the character going to the Caribbean, and the next novel picks up in the Caribbean. You know, and I think that's one of the reasons that she, quote, fell out of favor, because the publishing industry wanted African Americans here right on the ground, you know, in a national context.
Right.
So,
right.
Ishmael, I mean, you're seconding that, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. That's what Richard Wright. You know, Richard Wright in that group in Paris, you know, Time Magazine, had that notorious article called Amid Alien Corn, where they went over there and denounced all these guys, all these people in exile.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, you know, having Martin Luther King when he went international with his protests against the Vietnam War.
Absolutely.
You know, you're supposed to stay here.
Yes.
I think she left us. I've been rereading this, thinking of today. I think in this book gives us a blueprint, at least for the Paule Marshall kind of like where she wanted to be placed. And I feel like I was growing up with you, Evan, through this book too, where she talks about Grenada, and there's a whole imprint of how Praise Song for the Widow got to be written in this book. So it's, I think people who are interested of where she felt herself placed or where she placed herself would learn a lot from this book, which I believe, I don't know if Evan can tell us if there's there's some manuscript that's unfinished. I think we'd all love to hear that, but this is the last published book that we have, and we go on a journey from Virginia to Carriacou in the Caribbean. And she always talked about where she had sort of the 3 points of her journey was Brooklyn, New York, Barbados, and different places in the continent of Africa. But I'm curious, Evan, is there a Paule Marshall archive housed somewhere, and is there an unfinished book?
Well, Mary Helen and I have spent the last couple of years kind of going through the archive. Before my mother passed, she did give some of her personal books and papers to Brooklyn College, but the majority, you know, were with her when she passed, so they have been in storage. And about 2 years ago, Mary Helen came down and started going through, you know, what was there. And I think recently you discovered that there is a manuscript that she was working on that I haven't seen, but it's fascinating. So she was working on something just after Triangular Road, and that is fascinating because she obviously had some unfinished business that she was working on, just at the point where unfortunately she reached the point where she wasn't able to write anymore. So I think it could be wonderful. As I said, I haven't read it yet. I know Mary Ellen, you've had a look at it, but it is something that is fascinating that she was working on something, which was always the situation with her. She was always working on something. So
well, that's the last chapter in my biography. It's on the unpublished work. All the Paul Marshall archives are right here behind me. She had an unpublished manuscript that she called, she had two titles for it. One was Travel in Light, and the other one was En Passant. And in it, she talks about all the different countries that have formed her as a writer and as a person. And so she has notes from each one of these countries, African countries, Caribbean countries, a couple of things in the United States. And, it was clear that's where she was going at the end of her writing life. So I will be including all of those unpublished pieces.
I think that we limit ourselves. I think African-American writers, Black writers, Brendan Brooks got on me about that, Black writer, I want to say Black. They write in multiple traditions. And I just want to bring up Edwidge. And you look at Edwidge's work, and she invokes Native American mythology in her work. So I think that Black writers have sort of like a third eye, a third literary eye, where they're able to survey more than, say, those who are bound by monoculturalism. Can I put it that way?
Mm. Yes.
So so now I'm looking and seeing we have some other questions, and I just wanted to say I'm sad that we only have about 9 minutes left. So I wanted to say that we will try to get through as many questions as we can, but also I'm loving how rich this conversation has been because it's generated so much energy and response from everyone. So the next question that I have here is from Malcolm Cash for Brother Keith. It says from Malcolm Cash, what role, if any, do you see Williams and Marshall and African-American literature playing in high school and college composition classes?
Well, composition, if the primary goal in composition is to teach various forms of composing, you're always looking for material that is good material that it can be models for your students. And so along with a number of writers, you certainly you do well to use the work of Williams and Paul Marshall as well. So again, I've seen all these comments in the chat about restrictions, so I don't want to come up with a restrictive canon of what people should be reading in composition courses, but it'll do. It's good enough. You can't do everything, but certainly doing Marshall and doing Williams in composition class is good enough. It's a good idea. So that's the short answer.
Quick Song is a writer's textbook. It's like a writer's manual, that novel. Not only does it cover, cover the craft, but the politics of it.
You do very well to use Quick Song. Absolutely.
Beautiful. And so I have a question for Linda that I would love to hear the answer to too. It says, is Linda and her family, are they still doing that with authors? So I think they're asking if people wanted to connect with your family's publishing work, how could they get involved with the book selling, the publishing part of what you're doing?
I'm going to say no. We got really tired. We did it for about 3 or 4 years, published 2 books. One about Audre Lorde, another about, it was sort of a book about a woman whose parents had been like the Lovings, and then she also had an interracial marriage. And so it was about, it was like that. But it was really a lot of hard work. I am a full-time professor, my mom's 90, and my sister has another job. So we realized that we just couldn't keep it up. But that was, I think, a real lesson for me about publishing. I've written books and am writing a book right now for a mainstream publisher. And to see, sort of what it was taking to get these books published, even with new technologies, much cheaper printing, social media, it was still hard. I had to open my, Rolodex and, sort of ask favors of every single person, including the president of Hunter College. Can we please have a signing here, a giant signing in your auditoriums? There's so many people who want to read this book, buy this book, meet the authors, have a celebration. Calling up everyone I knew in media. I'm in media. I called everyone I knew to say, can you please write a little something about this? So it was a lot of work, but it was one of the most important things that I think I've ever done. But I was exhausted by the end.
Thank you so much. And I'm seeing there's a couple of questions that are aligned. So I want to try to put them together to see what everyone's thinking, which is a question about what can Black writers or writers who are coming into their own and not wanting to be boxed by canon or genre in the ways that we've already discussed, what kinds of things can we do, and what can we do to change the nature of how critique is seen? For example, how can we create our own circles of critique and review? Any thoughts about that?
I'm working on it. That's all I can say. I'm not in canons. I'm a poet, been writing poetry for 50 years. And so I'm not in poetry canons, and I'm not in poetry publishing circles. And so I'm trying to figure out now. I have a book coming out this summer. So yeah, I'm trying to figure that out now. How do you grow that network of independence and stuff like that? I don't have the hard and fast solution for that. I wish someone would give me the answer.
Yeah, canons are arbitrary. I did an anthology called From Totems to Hip Hop, in which I included my students along with well-known writers. And I went to an English conference, read a couple of poems, and asked which of the two poems were written by a student, which by a canonized author. 50% said the canonized author was the student, and 50% said the student was a canonized author. So I think it's all arbitrary canons. It depends upon, you need somebody like famous or powerful to make you part of the canon. Like some guy going to a bookstore and finding Moby Dick. Moby Dick becomes a canon, some powerful critic. So it's all arbitrary, I believe.
Thank you. So one thing I want to ask is that we had a good question here, because we only have a few minutes left, about what are good resources and workshops for Black writers. And it led me to think, when you spoke about some books that could be a masterclass in novel writing, I think one great way to close this out would be for each person who's shared today on the panel to pick a book by Williams or Paul Marshall that is the masterclass and the resource that you would recommend to everyone here to help them strengthen their writing, to help them broaden their imagination. And it's okay if it's the same one,
Okay.
but I'd love to hear what that is.
I'll start. I'll say for Marshall, I think I would work backwards and definitely start with Triangular Road, because I think even among her essays, it's a very personal journey through, and it's kind of like Langston used the big C, in that it travels with you, but it also travels through the work. And then Praise Song for the Widow. For me, it's, I think when I was younger, I would have said Brown Girl Brownstone, but Praise Song for the Widow, and so this travel of self-discovery. And it is that novel that is a bridge with the entire African diaspora, where you go from the ring shout of the Black church to the la vie tête of a Vodou ceremony, that it just kind of encompasses so much of our experience in such a poetic way. So those two, Triangular Road, start with that, because I will give you a sense of the whole work, and then ease into Praise Song for the Widow. I would work backwards.
I would say, in terms of, I came to my mother's work, be able to read it quite late because of the style of my mother's writing. And I was able to probably by the time I was 10 tackle a Brown Girl. But when I started to read Chosen Place, after about the first page, I put it down. I just oh my goodness, I was looking up words every two words, and it couldn't click. And so I picked it back up again, maybe a year or so later. And then I managed to get over the hump, and it started to just flow. And for me, that is her most powerfully intellectual achievement in terms of a writer, in terms of crafting a story, weaving, creating different complex characters, the prose, the vivid prose of what she writes about, the descriptive prose. It to me is just such a, it's like her Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. It's her finest achievement in terms of many things I think any writer seeks to achieve when they really take on it. And it was I can remember growing up with that book because it was taking a long time to write it. And she was telling a little kid how when she was having writer's block and mom is not gonna be able to make dinner right now. I'm not, go play. And when she was done, I could appreciate, and I was then able to read it. I could appreciate, wow, I can see why there were those titanic struggles she was having writing the book. Once I was able to read it and discovered for me how powerful written a book it was, the themes, the characters, the length of it, just in terms of how much story you have to write and keep together and keep the reader from not losing the plot lines, because they were so complex. So that for me is her towering work, and the one I still love the most.
Thank you.
I would suggest for Paule, I would suggest her short story, Rena, because she was asked to do that story by Harper's Magazine, and they wanted her to do an essay, as I remember it. It was 1962, and she said, well, she wasn't comfortable writing an essay, so she put these two forms together. She's a story, she said she called it a story essay. So she kind of fictionalized something that was also autobiographical. And I mentioned that because I think that's a very successful story. And she always felt like there was something wrong with it because it didn't fit in either one of those categories. So I think that's I think she was freer when she was trying to write in a form she was uncomfortable with. So that's the one that I would suggest. And then by John Williams, I would suggest his first, I think this is his first book. It's called The Angry Ones. And you can see him struggling to become a writer in that book. And he's very much dependent on Chester Himes, I think, in writing that book. It's got a lot of, the kind of detective, hard-boiled detective stuff in it. A lot of good stuff on race and racism and encountering that in New York and Los Angeles. But you can see him becoming a writer in that first book.
I wanted to say that I teach literary nonfiction this semester, and it's hard to choose among your favorites, but I read out loud to them Brown Girl, Brown Stones, because they were struggling to describe the places where they were from. And so I said, wait, listen to this. This is a love letter to the place where you're from. So this is, as an instructional, it's a nonfiction writing workshop, but fiction, you can learn from that. And that's what I use. I also wanted to give a shout out to Baldwin for the Arts, which is named for the ruthless James Baldwin. It's a it's a writing workshop that I'm starting with Jacqueline Woodson and some other artists. That will be a residency that's not unlike McDowell, but really small, and for people of color. And so we just are reading through applications for it now, and we'll announce the first group of artists that will be in residence at our upstate property in a couple months. So I'll put it's a place to nurture yourself as a writer and to be in community with other writers and other artists. So I'll put the link in the chat.
Thank you so much.
Hey. I think Let's see. Thank you very much to the panelists. First of all, to our moderator, Ms. Wilson, Jamia Wilson. Thank you so much. If we were in person, you'd hear a round of applause. The best we can do is virtual at the moment, but we're working on it. We're working on it for sure. But thank you so much. You had a lot of territory to cover, and there's never enough time in these types of situations. And thank you for a magnificent job there. Obviously, we want to also express on behalf of the Center for Black Literature, Edwidge Danticat, thank you so much. Evan Marshall, for your insights. Ishmael Reed has kind of you've been my literary hero. I won't say for how long, but more than most of my life, yeah, actually. But I started young. Linda Villarosa, thank you so much. Always glad to see colleagues from the CUNY system. And Keith Gilyard, brother, thank you so much for your insights and perspectives. We share the generation and experiences, and it's been fantastic. So again, we would ask our colleagues and friends in the audience and everybody who's in attendance to please join me in thanking our guests. And